second most popular destination. Well, let's speak with Christa Rottensteiner. She's the Chief of Mission at the International Organization for Migration in the UK. Thank you so much, Christa, for joining us here on the programme. So if you were to compare the numbers that we're seeing here in the UK, net migration reaching 606,000 compared to the rest of the world, how would you assess it?
Well, I think, first of all, we should look at the overall trends over the last few decades. And the UK, the population in the UK that's foreign-born has remained relatively stable at around 14%. And that's very similar to other high-income countries like the US, like Spain, for example. And it's actually lower than countries like Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. But just to drill into the figures a bit more, the UK figures, because I think the overall number doesn't actually tell us this much. I think because there's so many different groups of people, like we've heard previously. And actually, the increase that we've seen between this release of the numbers and the last one 6 months ago is actually due to a change in how things are counted. So the first time the Office of National Statistics has included asylum seekers, which they hadn't done previously. So the increase that we've seen is actually due to a change in how we count numbers. So we haven't actually really seen an increase as such. And as we've just heard, the trend is now slowing down. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, and also to say that most people who arrive in the UK arrive on regular and orderly routes. But very often the headlines are, quite different, and they talk about the very small minority who arrive in small boats.
Yes, I mean, just to give clarity, as you say, even those graphs that we were just looking at, the bulk of people coming to this country are doing so with visas to study and work.
Yes, exactly. So it's people who fill very critical gaps, particularly in the health and social care sectors. So these are people who are really needed to keep the NHS going. Last year, a third of all doctors who were recruited were actually from overseas. So it is a really important element of the economy. And also, if we look forward, if the UK wants to meet its net zero target, we know that more migrant workers will be needed because of skill shortages. And there will actually be a global competition for those skills that certain nations don't have.
Yeah, and we're sort of looking at geopolitical issues here as well. More people arriving from Ukraine, for example, and Hong Kong.
Yes, exactly. So the rising numbers are due to the conflict in Ukraine. Unfortunately, they're due to tensions in Hong Kong. So that has led to the UK to allow a certain group of British nationals to come to the UK. So, but again, these are safe and orderly routes, which mean that people get protection who need it. But I think what is really important, that protection is also offered to those who come on very dangerous journeys.
And at present, where that whole situation is being politicised here in the UK.
Yes, it is. It is definitely a challenge. So I think just to come back to the global perspective, you talked about the number of migrants, and that is a situation which is, again, an orderly situation, and the UN Migration Agency is very much aiming to make sure that this migration benefits everyone, the migrants, the countries of origin, and also the destination countries. Where there's much more of a problem is forced displacement, and that's due to conflict, due to disasters. So this is where we really need to see international action so that we tackle the root causes. And I think that can depoliticize it a little bit, because we see people in really desperate situations who need to get out of there. And we need to also remember that most of people who face conflict stay in their own country. So half of the 100 million displaced people stay in their own country. And then the vast majority of people who are able to cross the border, they again stay in the neighboring regions. So it's actually a small minority only.
Yes, we don't often talk about the burden that the neighbouring countries also feel when they have millions of people crossing over into their borders.
Absolutely. And that's a very challenging situation. Millions of people surrounding Syria have, countries have taken millions of people. So it is very often countries that are already struggling economically that then face an additional burden. So many of the displaced people don't make it towards the UK. And also within Europe, we see that compared to the UK, most asylum seekers go to other countries in Europe. And per capita, we see that the numbers of asylum seeking cases are actually much higher elsewhere.
OK, Christa Rottensteiner, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.